So tonight's conversation is about the actual physics of ascension. And we've been talking about this for some time. Many of you know our work, fractalfield.com, verify.net. And you see our YouTube channel at Fractal Field, it has over 1 million views. And so we're pretty global. And we've been teaching the physics of consciousness for 30 years. So, and we're happy to work with Neil, particularly because all of the wonderful friends here who have been talking about what is a portal to ascension, we think we can contribute something important to that conversation, which is the actual electrical engineering of what is ascension and a portal to ascension. It has to do with how charge is compressed and forms a kind of bubble called longitudinal interferometry. And that bubble of coherent compressed charge, more axes of spin symmetry, which is literally the next dimension, that then centripetal compression of charge enables the aura to penetrate from what's called transverse or up and down electromagnetic waves to the more coherent and penetrating and distributed longitudinal electromagnetics, sometimes incorrectly called scalar or torsional. And those compressional longitudinal waves can cross and act at a distance in an array, a fractal array, the dodecaecosa earth grid, for example, the sacred sites. And so the compression of the nodes of that array form a nest, a longitudinal node bubble, where things like telepathy and access to the collective unconscious and ancestor phone calls and labyrinths and cathedrals are possible because of the charge compression at those nodes. And the crossing of magnetics at those cross points, sometimes called four-wave mixing in phase conjugate optics, or the sacred four directions in ancestral terms, creates a compression point. And that's where waves converge, and the vortex that form there nest more perfectly and enable the translation of inertia from the transverse electromagnetics, which are more local, to the more long distance compressional waves, the longitudinal waves. And to get into that compressional array, for example, what successful death is, requires a compression event, which is what happens, for example, during successful death, during those geometries that you see, the Clouvet form constants, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral at death. And we even now know that during successful death, there's a sequence of sounds that you hear, which are actually infrasound, which are also contributing to that compression event, that successful black hole event that enables successful death, because it enables your memory to get into that higher, quote unquote, voltage, which is actually higher compression of that array. And that actually brings up the conversation for this evening, which is, imagine a world within which at every electrical engineering university, like mine, University of Detroit, the physics of what it is to have and build a soul were taught to electrical engineers. Imagine if that were common scientific knowledge. That means that governments and universities would no longer engage in soulless behavior because they would know what it is. And religion wars would be unnecessary because everyone would agree if all this was based on the principles of physics. Well, it turns out that actually now we can know. For example, there are many ways in which the coherence of the aura is measurable. For example, medicine knows that you can measure whether you have an immune system if your heart harmonics are what's called fractal or harmonic inclusive. Well, it turns out that the perfection of harmonic inclusiveness in heart rate variability, which is a fractal heart is a healthy heart, that compression of the most possible harmonics that you invite into your heart, remember, perfect compassion is perfect compression, is a measure of immune health because it's a measure of compression success. Well, that's an example of what feeds the aura, and the aura is measurable with the GDV, gas discharge visualization, et cetera. So suddenly, if governments knew that not only is that how you get an immune system to build that coherent charged bubble you call a soul, for example, when you have a coherent bubble of charge around your aura, you're able to lucid dream. The Egyptians called it the Ba from the Ka, Gurdjieff called it the Kesjan body, spiritualists call it the rainbow light body. Electrical engineers now have a term for it. It's a coherent longitudinal array which makes your aura plasma projective. And then when you take that plasma, that charge of your aura, and you're enabled to project it, you begin to be able to do things like lucid dream, which predicts whether you'll take memory through death, predicts whether you can astral travel, remote view. It brings up the question, it's so common. You see these very advanced scientists now admitting that many of them have had near-death experiences and even remember taking their eyeballs outside their head. Now, this is the first real physics of consciousness that explains how your eyeballs, how your vision can leave your body, because now we know what the physics of consciousness actually is. Your consciousness normally is the synaptic array, the spark gaps, the Indra's net inside your head, which is an array. And yes, you inhabit the array, but actually what you inhabit is the plasma vortex tornado inside that array. And when it becomes coherent, that plasma vortex tornado can move coherently outside your head. Practical example. So, the hundreds of kids now who are being trained to see without their eyes, and there's many of those programs. Ours is just one at flameinmind.com, where we measure the brain waves of kids who are blindfolded and they're seeing very clearly without their eyes when they go into this trance or bliss state. And they all report the same thing. They say, a vortex tunnel appears inside my head when they go into this relaxed trance bliss. And then they look through that vortex tunnel like it's an eyeball, and an eye forms in the tornado. Well, that's an example of a plasma vortex creating the physics, and it's called phase conjugate perception. It creates the physics of vision. So that kind of plasma compression, plasma vortex centripetal implosion is actually a big key to the physics of what vision is itself, and a big key to what you take with you when you die, that plasma vortex. So this evening's lecture is entitled The Answer to 16 Questions for a Reason. Suppose you understood what the reality of a plasma vortex was, and suppose you understood what makes a plasma vortex centripetal. Suddenly you could understand, and then there's a list of 16 questions which are the answer to the mysteries of the universe. And for that, I'm going to share a slideshow about that. This is the answer to 16th question. Let me see if I get my slideshow up here correctly. So hopefully you are seeing. If you knew what a plasma vortex was and how it becomes centripetal, hint, fractal conjugation, then you can know what is the physics of, and then there's a list of 16 questions which are the answer to all the major problems of the universe. So suddenly, the answer to all of the great questions of science and history come down to one simple understanding. What is a plasma vortex and what makes it centripetal? So first of all, let's try to get very clear about, defining our terms here. What is plasma? Plasma is the name for a cloud of charge. Normally in electrical engineering, if there's a cloud of charge or plasma, it involves heat to keep the charge circulating. In very rare circumstances, a charge circulation can occur without heat when it's centripetal or negentropic, which is called cold plasma. Cold atmospheric plasma is one of the most popular subjects in all of medicine right now because it heals so many things. We think the cold atmospheric plasma of Therify.net is the best example because we've discovered the best geometry that enables plasma vortex to be stable without heat, which is called phase conjugate negentropy. A practical example, when Victor Schauberger was watching his water vortex with piezoelectrically doped rock powder spontaneously get colder, called implosion. And the moment when it spontaneously got colder was the moment it started generating electricity from gravity, which later we're going to see is a key to the Hannibal-Nazi Bell vortex, which was a gravity maker. So that's an example of implosion, a centripetal force. So plasma, which is simply a cloud of charge, you would need then to ask, if you were a real scientist, well, what is charge? And we want to be clear here. The universe is comprised of a single contiguous compressible media named charge. It's a little more accurate than the term ether. And the compressibility plus minus compression rarefaction of that compressible media is named plus and minus charge. And that behaves like a superfluid. Literally, in electrical engineering, when we say voltage and amperage, we don't mean that electric charge is like a fluid, pressure being voltage, Tesla's term was tension, and amperage being amount or rate of flow. We mean that electricity is a fluid. And once we understand that, you begin to be able to think in more disciplined unified field terms. So thinking of the unified field of compressible charge enables you to be more unified field in your thinking, and also enables you in just a moment to make the jump to see how gravity is created from charge when it becomes centripetal, because when charge implodes, there is acceleration of charge toward the center of fractal symmetry, and the name for that acceleration of charge toward that center is the gravity. So suddenly that is a unified field once you understand how fractal phase conjugation causes the charge implosion acceleration to center, named the gravity. Another problem that solves is now you know exactly what mass and time are. That charge rotates and it stores the inertia we name mass, and the charge rotates and it creates a period of rotation named time. So space-time is not bent when charge accelerates. What happens is when it accelerates, the rate of spin increases, and that is named time. It's not bending space-time. It wasn't a helpful terminology. What's important to know is that time is merely a name for the rate or period of charge rotation. Suddenly, then we begin to understand, for example, time reversal, which is the name for when spin patterns return to a state of increased order, which is why in physics, although time reversal has been measured, it was only a measurement of negentropy, which is a return to order, which is why you can't time reverse toward disorder. You can only time reverse toward order in the measurements of the physics of time reversal from phase conjugate optics, et cetera, et cetera. So we're beginning to have a way to think with discipline about the unified field in terms of simply rotating charge. So then what causes that charge to get centripetal is when that pine cone shape adds and multiplies recursively and lets the spin move towards center. So if you look on the bottom right here, you have the top-down view of not only DNA and every living protein, but I wrote the new equation that proved this is exactly the top-down view of hydrogen, that hydrogen's electron shell radii are exactly golden ratio multiples of Planck, the musical key signature of the universe. So this is what hydrogen looks like. And when the waves rotate around this golden mean spiral, which defines the fractality that is hydrogen, they add and multiply recursively and constructively, not just the wavelength, but the phase velocity. And so when the velocity is heterodyne constructively, that turns compression of charge when that symmetry is fractal or golden ratio or conjugate. That allows recursive heterodyning to be constructive because golden ratio defines the solution to recursion constructive heterodyning. So the adding and multiplying of phase velocities produces acceleration of charge towards center from that specific geometry of compression of charge. When that kind of compression produces acceleration to center because of fractal recursion conjugation, that acceleration of charge towards center is named the gravity. That is the origin of centripetal forces and all centripetal and negentropic forces. So it's true that many physicists have already agreed that fractality is the cause of gravity, but we're the first ones to actually publish the equations that prove how it is that fractality causes gravity. And these are some of our equations in the literature. So what we did, and we're not going to do technical physics here, but and remember, we're leading up to the physics of Ascension here. So we're going somewhere spiritual and we're starting with physics. But what we did was we published the Navier-Stokes generalized wave equations, which proved that when waves converge in golden mean ratio, they produce the maximum constructive wave interference. We did that first by showing that that's true of waves in a line, and then we solved the problem in a way that gravity science has not solved the problem of gravity, which is physics can't accurately model gravitational relations between bodies that are not in a line. Well, we solved that problem in an interesting way. It turns out that if you take that line of golden ratio wave nodes and you stellate that line around the axes of the dodecaecosa, this our star mother kit, that you produce the 3D solution, the only possible 3D fractal, the infinite stellation of dodecaecosa. We call it the star mother kit. Also happens to be the geometry of fullerenes and carbon and DNA, Earth grid, zodiac, and the universe. So then we had a set of wave equations that proved that we had solved the problem of maximum constructive wave interference. And once we proved that and we published it, these are the publications. You can see all the physics at fractalfield.com/vacuum energy. And these are the publications. And the second one, we explain in detail why that is the cause of gravity, because that creates the compression, the geometry of compression that turns compression into acceleration and therefore implosion. Now, for those who would like pictures more than equations, this is another view of what that looks like, that down the throat of that perfected, what's called phase conjugate fractal vortex, that series of golden ratio wave interference, which both add and multiply recursively constructively. You solve the problem of recursion, solve the problem of embedding. Perfect embedding is perfect entanglement. That's called phase conjugation or charge implosion. And that produces acceleration of charge from compression of charge. So basically, the donuts are nesting down the throat of a vortex in golden ratio, and they begin to implode. Now, the key component here is what enables that implosion of charge to penetrate through the center point of that vortex, literally the 0 point, which we now know is Planck length and time, 1.61 times 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, which is the throat of the toothpaste tube, as it were. And at that threshold point, the inertia that arrived from the left in a transverse up and down wave goes down that perfected caduceus, golden ratio vortex, and the inertia is translated from up and down motion on the left to compressional wave called longitudinal or scalar on the right, where the direction of compression, the direction of the wave compression, is parallel to the direction of propagation, unlike the transverse, where the wave goes up and down perpendicular to the direction of propagation, which makes the wave more penetrating. Then, if those longitudinal waves then cross again at a distance, they will go through almost anything like a Faraday cage, and they will create accident at a distance, because when the longitudinal wave crosses again at a distance, it sets up those vortex again, where the longitudinal inertia is interchanged with the transverse. And you can then resynthesize heat at a distance, for example, solving the problem of heat containment, the holy grail of fusion research, but also the physics of all action at a distance, solving the problem that Einstein called spooky, and enabling us to understand how things like Stargates and portals work, which we will get to a bit later. The point being that the nodes in that array can be a place where the inertia is exchanged like a perfectly distributed, think of it as DNA radio or the collective unconscious or the communion of saints. So to get into that array, you have to do the compression well so that you can get to the high voltage that enables that perfected distribution. So basically, at the center of every black hole is phase conjugation to Planck by golden ratio. And the equation for that here, which many of you have seen my work at fractalfield.com, is named The Origin of Biologic Negentropy, which is the name of the equation and the name of my book at fractalfield.com. And basically it's simple: Planck length or time times integer exponents of golden ratio, called phase conjugation or fractal, produces a series of wavelengths and frequencies, which include all of the geometry that allows nature to emerge from chaos, called self-organization or origin of negentropy. For example, 3 exact radii of hydrogen, the wavelength of ADP, the most important molecule in the body, 1.91 angstroms, the exact only 2 frequencies of color that enable photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is negentropic because it's phase conjugate fractal. It produces the definition of sacred dimensions, which is embeddability in the longitudinal, the British foot is exact golden ratio times Planck. It produces the Schumann harmonics, the brainwave harmonics, the heart rate variability harmonics, the LF Mayer wave, 0.1 hertz. It produces the Venus year, Earth year, galactic year, and precessional year, all predicted by my equation named origin of biologic negentropy. So that is a geometry of perfect implosion that is the way out of chaos and proves that your physics teacher was wrong when she said, the universe is condemned to entropy. That is a lie. There is a way out of chaos. For example, how the Schumann harmonics make the Earth grid negentropic, named the Gaia principle. So now you understand how a plasma vortex can get centripetal, because it can implode through Planck, accelerate through the speed of light at the Planck threshold. And we should mention that the dominant velocity faster than light in the thousands of measurements made by the famous professor Raymond Chow proved that the dominant measurement of speeds faster than light are between 1.5 and 1.7 times c, the speed of light, pointing directly to 1.618 golden ratio as the dominant measured velocity faster than the speed of light that's been measured, which is the smoking gun which proves my theory of gravity, that gravity is caused by implosion through the speed of light at the Planck threshold by phase conjugate golden ratio. That is the cause of gravity, because that's the hole at the bottom of the vortex that allows the charge to escape. Einstein said, well, if we understood infinite non-destructive compression, well, it is literally infinite, and the compression is non-destructive because it implodes through the speed of light at the center. And that creates the array. For example, why Jodie Foster could lucid dream in the movie Contact by using a dodecahedron. Okay, so now you know what implosion is. Here's the 16 questions we answered. Now that you know what implosion, what centripetal force in a plasma vortex is, you also understand that if you were watching a shaman steer a tornado and you saw the bioplasmic streamers leave the belly of the shaman and embed in the vortex of the tornado, and the shaman becomes the centripetal force of the tornado and steers it, and this tornado falls in this love with the shaman because the shaman feels its pain better than it feels its own pain, and the shaman calls that eating the hucha, or eating the anger, or feeling the pain. And so, because feeling the pain of the tornado is to feel whatever is making the tornado bleed charge due to broken fractality. A metal trailer park, for example, is painful for a tornado because it can't implode capacitance through it. And so the tornado will go out of its way to destroy metal buildings because they are painful to its plasma body, versus sacred stone structures, which feel like part of the body of the tornado. The tornado will never destroy, because it feels like part of the body. And that living plasma body is the new physics we're beginning to understand of why, when a plasma vortex is implosively centripetal, that is the nature of life itself. That's what we must teach to our electrical engineering schools in order that we can end these religion wars, and also end the soulless behavior of governments and universities who don't know what a soul is and can't make a government decision based on what a soul is. And that leads to a Borg culture, and that's the problem we are here to solve. Once we understand the centripetal plasma, we understand Therify.net, where we took a big pine cone of phase conjugate harmonics all the way from phase conjugate optics in the noble gas plasma tube, we'll see a picture in a minute, and then with an RF frequency in phase, triggered at 500,000 volts, down to infrasound, all those harmonics in perfect caduceus golden ratio. And we imploded those plasma at 500,000 volts at megahertz range. And we make these big pine cones kiss noses accurately. And at the center, you have a very centripetal electric field. It started with Antoine Priory, and then we figured out how to perfect the harmonics because we learned the principle was phase conjugation, which he didn't know. And Therify.net is actively, commercially successful in 25 countries, doing rejuvenation, pain reversal, swelling reduction has been measured, et cetera, et cetera. We don't make medical claims, but you can see hundreds of dramatic results reports there in the Therify blog, et cetera. So Now you know how healing plasma creates negentropy and life force, and we realize what's behind the concept of medbed that's so popular these days. It is the rejuvenation possible when a phase conjugate field is broad spectral. And by the way, when you make it more broad spectral and higher voltage, you have first lucid dreaming, and then at higher charge densities, you have the physics of what is a stargate or portal. We may talk more about that later. I give you the witnessed example. Thank you to Maya, who works with our Therify in Athens and Paris, who describes in the therify.net blog in detail how therify.net plasma dramatically triggered lucid dreaming and telepathy. And we know that lucid dreaming is the coherence of your aura that enables you to take memory through death, for example, and the beginning of remote viewing, astral travel, plasma projection, what really means to be a Shem on, or the raising of the Jed. These are all names for the principle of being plasma projected, because you have the coherent longitudinal bubble around your body because you're imploding, and you obeyed my bumper sticker, which says, get fractal or get dead. So if you knew, here's our 16 question, next question, you would know what an elemental or an angel is. You know, angels' bodies are made of the plasma donuts. Here's our plasma donut, okay? Well, if you take this spiral on the vortex, indexed by the symmetry of the tetra, you have Hebrew and Sanskrit, goldenmean.info/DNA ring. Now, if you take the superset of those spiral vortex elements of symmetry of plasma donuts into the superset of a tetracube, the Hebrew Sanskrit, you have a hypercube symmetry, intro to dodeca, and that is, sorry about that. Apologies. That hypercube symmetry of the plasma vortex is the alphabet of the Ophanim angels John D. and Kelly used to communicate with large interstellar beings. You can see all the pictures and graph beautiful at goldenmean.info/Ophanim, OPHANIM. Point is, hypercube plasma donut domain symmetries assembled is how you make the body of an angel, interstellar plasma intelligence, out of charge. You know, all the plasma universe scientists these days believe in angels. Well, there's good reason, because centripetal, even interstellar plasma can be coherent enough to be intelligent. You know, our tornadoes think that we're drunk because we don't communicate with our elementals, because we don't believe in them, because we don't know how plasma becomes mindful. Now that we know that a plasma vortex can become centripetal, that's the beginning of self-awareness, the ability to self-refer. And this is the geometry of perfected self-reference, non-destructive self-reentry, defines the onset of consciousness for that reason, because it defines the origin of self-awareness. And so now that we can know why plasma is intelligent, for example, ball lightning is famous for responding to telepathy, we can understand the physics of that, because that implosion of that vortex, it connects with the longitudinal array, think of it as DNA radio, and the plasma becomes mindful. So next question, you could then know, if you knew why a plasma vortex was entropy, you could know why life, you could know the physics of what is life force inside a seed. Very important concept. You know, a seed is alive or dead if it can suck in the first nutrient. Well, you know what that suction is? Plasma implosion. I give you an example. One of the best biodynamic agriculture groups in France just purchased a Therify just to charge their seeds. We know that the ancient pyramids, they were rarely used for burial, and they weren't used to live inside. No, well, they called them the immortality machine, the resurrection machine, because it would project your plasma. But also, they were largely used to charge the seeds. When you zap the seeds with implosive plasma like Therify, they're reporting 200 to 500% increase in growth in seeds, especially hemp or marijuana. So once you know what life force is in a seed, you can serve life. next question. You would then know the physics of what survives death. We just talked about that black hole. And by the way, you can see all those geometries of the physics of the geometry of the necessary black hole for successful death, goldenmean.info/immortality. You can know the physics of out-of-body visions, lucid dreaming. Remember famously when Dr. Ed Wilson discovered that golden ratio phonon brainwave audio head binaural beats were one of the most powerful drivers that your plasma aura, your vision was projected out of your head. It was literally transcendent golden ratio binaural sounds. Now we have the perfect ones at flameinmind.com. When you see the flame in sound, the world's most powerful bliss-inducing binaural beat. Well, the reason is because that implosion generated by the perfect binaural tuned to Planck golden ratio and 180 degrees out of phase from the two stereo channels produces implosive plasma projection, the physics of bliss. So this is a clue to the physics of remote viewing. Also, for example, why remote viewing and remote healing is always more effective when sender and receiver are at the longitudinal grid sacred site nodes, just like labyrinths, cathedrals, and stone circles require. And also what's best for Agnihotra. The same places that Kozyrev measured telepathy is most possible, the same place that Bruce Cathy measured reduced nuclear critical mass. Because when the capacitance is implosive, it is the opposite of nuclear radiation. An example of implosive capacitance was the Ark of the Covenant, which was originally designed to contain their nukes, the so-called Plague of Azov. So you know what survives death, you know what out-of-body vision, lucid dreaming is, that plasma, the vortex, the plasma vortex that's centripetal. It's literally a tornado that's projective. And by the way, you then know where ghosts will go after death and why, as Korotkov measured with infrared, et cetera, because they go to the place of sacred space, which is plasma compression, because they need that compression to be released instead of being stuck ghosts. And we talked about why Therapy.net is so famous for helping release ghosts as well, because what a ghost is stuck if it can't get the implosive compression to accelerate its charge into the distribution, into the longitudinal array, which the Aboriginals call the song line or dreaming track, which we call the collective unconscious. In Christianity, it's called the communion of saints. Everybody's got a name for it, Akashic records, and nobody until now had the electrical engineering. And with the electrical engineering, we can design successful death. Successful death is possible on the altar at Machu Picchu. In general, successful death is much more difficult in a hospital due to the fact that the electrosmog prevents charge distribution efficiency, the definition of sacred space, and therefore what you need for successful birth and death and bliss. So you understand all action at a distance, Stargates, we talked about that. Now, the key to Stargate is where the implosive compression, sorry, it's an active night here, but the implosive compression has to be tuned from the send site to the receive site, so that when the Stargate, remember the movie Stargate was made by using the letters of the Ophanim-Enochian on that grid. So the Ophanim-Enochian letters were used to make the movie Stargate for very good reason, because that's hypercube physics of how to steer the plasma vortex into conjugate implosion. And at the focal point, there is that threshold where everything that approaches that implosive compression point is compressed and accelerated. The key is the receive point has to be perfectly tuned to the complex harmonic of the send point. And that's some very advanced physics, the physics of Stargate. But all these secret space program and super soldiers are talking about using these jump gates or Stargates. And no one except us is talking about the physics of what a Stargate or portal is. And that's important because later when we talk in the ET history about how the frequency fence was created by the nuclear generators in the hollow metal moon, and they made the frequencies to prevent the Stargates from working to trap the Draconian and the reptilian Kingu here for a time, the Federation of Planets led by Andromedans and Pleiadians. To understand how that quarantine was first administered, you have to understand the physics of Stargates, because that's how they're regulated. It also helps understand the physics of the Christian concept of rapture. The guns will melt because they have the wrong dielectric constant. Also, the ancestors will rise from the dead because that's what allows the plasma to then be again distributed and makes them mobile, etc. So the physics of rapture, the physics of bliss, is the implosive compression of phase conjugate fractality, making living plasma into massive living collective bliss body, taking the silver seed to a new home in the sun, as it were. Next question, you would know how hydrogen makes gravity. And we gave you that picture that the wave electron shells implosively add and multiply. That's how the fractality of hydrogen enables the implosion called gravity. And it also explains why objects fall to the ground. So again, if you don't know why objects fall to the ground, you can't answer any of these questions. Sorry, you know, Einstein, NASA, and Stephen Hawking, you didn't get it. And unfortunately, if you don't know how a plasma vortex is built and how it becomes centripetal and negentropic, you can't answer any of these questions. But once you know what a plasma vortex is and how it got implosion, you answered all the questions. You know how Gaia, Earth's Schumann field, became negentropic. You know how a soul forms in imploding DNA. This is important so that you know that the physics of bliss, we discuss the harmonics of the physics of bliss in much greater detail in our new professional film series, goldenmean.info/Kundalini. And basically, here's the short summary. The spine liquid pump harmonics, the sacrocranial, golden ratio times Planck. The brainwave harmonic cascade, golden ratio times Planck. The breath harmonic cascade, golden ratio times Planck. The EKG frequency signature, 0.6 better than 0.1 hertz, golden ratio times Planck, et cetera, et cetera. And we've measured, after I defined the first time the physics of heart coherence, realheartcoherence.com, that those heart harmonics measurably predict the moment at which DNA braiding becomes phase dense. That is, the DNA braids recursively, embeds because of that low frequency phonon cascade. So low frequency phonon cascade of brainwaves and heart coherence measurably braid implode DNA recursively, and that takes thread to string to rope to fat rope. Beautiful pictures, goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. And all the literature, all the physics is all there. So that implosion in DNA is part of the massive broad spectral centripetal force in the aura. Remember, the more broad spectral the phase conjugation, the more centripetal and negentropic. So you have high frequencies in hydrogen, and then lower frequencies in the molecules of DNA, and then lower frequencies yet in the heart harmonics and the brainwave harmonics and the breath harmonics. And eventually that becomes a very broad spectral implosive pine cone kissing noses, and your body becomes massively centripetal. And that is the biologic definition of power. It's what's made the Dracos more powerful than humans until we learn to get centripetal, or dead, we're food for parasites. And we're going to get to that in a minute. So this is called fusion in the blood. And then it introduces the science of extraterrestrial history, the turning point being when we learn to make fusion in the blood. All the parasitic ETs are here, not because their technology is interesting. They're here because they need something from the DNA library, which is how to make a soul, Humpty Dumpty's egg. So the ability to get DNA lined up to braid implode, the physics of how to make a soul, is the only thing that's actually, or the major thing that's actually interesting about Earth to all of the parasitic ETs, the Greys, the Pleiadian Tegatans, who are doomed in about 800 years because they used parthenogenesis and they lost their soul. And the Dracos, when they abducted the teenagers to steer the time chariot Montauk, when the Greys took the humans for the abductions after the Greada Treaty, they always were looking for the lucid dreamers. The lucid dreamers are the one who have that kind of coherence in their aura that predicts not just ability to take memory through death, but to have a soul. So this is the turning point of human leverage in the ET history. And again, that whole story of the ET history I've been researching and assembling for 30 years is at fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And that fusion in the blood is the physics of bliss, and that's how you get a soul. And to raise a child who can lucid dream and have a coherent aura is the difference between a society that becomes a cog in the Borg collective versus ensouled humans. So we need to be able to teach with physics what a soul is if we're to emerge from the soullessness of artificial intelligence, for example. Next question we've answered, how the Nazi bell or Hanabu flew. So you'll see the pictures of this at fractalfield.com/vacuum energy. Basically, you have the perfected vortex like Schauberger's. It's made of mercury for high inertia, and then there's a trace iron powder made soluble with a dopant solvent, which makes that liquid red. And that perfect vortex has extremely high centripetal force. And then if it's tuned in a vacuum, you have two concentric cylinders spinning to assemble that perfect vortex, which is how a vortex makes gravity. And it's because the West, the US, did not know why an object falls to the ground, did not know why a vortex makes gravity. That's why America lost to the Nazis, who took over the South Pole, base on Mars, and now Ceres, and basically run a big chunk of the solar system. Why? Because we were too stupid to know why an object falls to the ground and how a vortex makes gravity. And we should be upset about that because the government turned to schizophrenia at the moment they lied about losing to the Kingu and the Nazis at the South Pole when Admiral Byrd got kicked out. And that's the story. You can read that story. So all of the secret space program, SSP survivors, and all of the super soldiers, and there are dozens and dozens of them now, are telling exactly the same story. So that there are witnesses now, there are testimonies, and the government is going to lose the lawsuit. And this should take down the government that chose to lie about losing to the Nazis, because that's also what turned our government into schizophrenia. And we're going to fix that by teaching the physics. So if you teach your kids why an object falls to the ground, then you won't have to be part of that slave culture. And it is a slave culture. Read about it. Secret Space Program, the testimonies at Gaia TV and at Super Soldier Talk are just some of the many sources which are all coherent to the same core story. So this is also, this perfect vortex that's centripetal is also the physics of zero-point energy. It's the generalized principle of how you implode charge from the vacuum. So essentially, if you have a source of bliss, you become a source of charge from the vacuum. People are saying, oh, why don't we have free energy devices? Well, I have an answer to you. I say to you, once you learn a regular hygiene of bliss process, at that point, you have your own source of charge. Up until then, you are effectively a parasite because you don't have your own source of charge. You're not steering your own tornado. Well, you see, the human body during bliss is one of the best examples of zero-point energy, fractal implosion physics around. It is the teaching lesson. I'm reminded of Valerie's teachers when she saw her sainted grandmother floating above the ground. There's many testimonies. Well, how did the body make gravity? Hello. What is the principle of vacuum energy? Why did Tesla fail? And you can see the Tesla's mistakes and Einstein's mistakes at vacuum energy, fractalfield.com/vacuum energy. You know, we're not saying that they weren't genius, wonderful contributors, but there were some serious mistakes which had dramatic consequences. And one of those mistakes was Tesla's mistake when he failed to achieve power distribution without wires because he put the receivers, he didn't put them accurately at the longitudinal nodes. Two, he didn't use the right harmonic series. You have to use the perfect equation for the harmonics, my equation, to get the right frequencies to use. 60 cycles is the opposite. 50 cycle is necessary. For example, carbon won't grow. And by the way, 50 cycle is healing. 60 cycle is not. That's called one of Tesla's mistakes. And this is also the most important new technology on the planet, carbon nano. And sorry, America, 60 hertz. That's Tesla's mistake. So that's a clue to why Tesla failed to create power at a distance. The pyramid builders, on the other hand, they used the infrasound phase conjugate harmonics of the Schumann to trigger the piezo pyramids, as we measured in the harmonics of Sam's Bosnian pyramid. And people come from all the world for the rejuvenation there. So the pyramid builders did achieve global power distribution without wires, as they got the geometry right and the frequencies right. We discussed that at length in the vacuum energy conversation. And you see that here's our last three questions. We now know the physics of consciousness itself. Consciousness itself is the plasma tornado. That's what it is. That's what you inhabit. That's what you steer. That's the reality. That's what's born inside the synapses of the brain, but not limited to. Under the right conditions, that plasma vortex can propagate. And that is the physics of successful death and lucid dreaming, et cetera, et cetera. That is the answer to the question, what is the physics of consciousness? It's a plasma vortex. You know, the 5 golden ratio harmonics that we measured at flameinmind.com in my brainwaves during intense bliss, that is a smoking gun to what is the physics of consciousness, because the brain harmonics are massively synthesizing a massively centripetal plasma vortex, intense bliss, which introduces the physics of Kundalini, as we discussed. So that is the answer to the what is the physics of consciousness itself. And then you see how that is the physics of real ascension. It was called ascension, the next dimension, because the number of axes of spin symmetry you superpose can only go past 3 dimensions. If you take the tetra cube and you want to rotate that into the next dimension, the only way to do it is tilt the cube 32 degrees. Well, you can almost see it here in the center. That cube is at 32 degrees tilt from the dodecahedron in the center of Star Mother Kit, goldenbean.info/kit. And that's the chin angle of the Sphinx for that reason. So you tilt the cube at 32 degrees, and then you blink 5 times and spin it, and you have dodeca. And that is golden ratio to the edge length of the cube, 0.618. And that is the next dimension. It's the next superposed axis spin symmetry of charge, the definition of the next dimension. So we go to the next dimension, and it is the next higher density, because that initiates implosion. Then you braid the braid of that, the dodecahedron ratchets down a helix, that's the map of DNA, and then you braid the braid of the braid on the braid, embedding shortwave into longer and longer and longer perfected entanglement, and the plot thickens, DNA gets thicker, and embeds a longer wave, and eventually you're steering tornadoes. So that's called ascension, because that's the process by which your aura becomes centripetal enough and longitudinal coherent enough in that big plasma bubble to enable you to distribute your charge in that fractal dodecaecosa earth grid array, the collective unconscious. And that perfected distribution, other people call it other dimensional, and we have all these subjective terms, but now we have the electrical engineering. And we have some pictures here. I think maybe we're going to be out of time for our pictures. But the pictures are all at fractalfield.com/vacuum energy. And finally, I see my time is almost up here. How body parasites and astral parasites and ET parasites get toasted. That is, that is the 16th question. So just to try to be dramatic about that, you know, they said, if you have a source of bliss, you will have no problem with parasites, astral, stomach parasites, or ET parasites. What's the physics? Well, the physics is that at the center of the implosive plasma vortex, where many paths and errands meet, the implosion is perfected, and that enables a situation where only the shareable wave survives. Shelley and I were talking about this in our last video, theshareablewave.com. Thank you to Shelley. And the wave at the center only emerges from the compression if it is in perfect phase discipline. Now, electrically, we know exactly what that means. That means everything that's destructive interference is canceled. But psychologically, do we know what that means? It means you cannot die or enter bliss or death successfully if you're angry, because you haven't sorted all your experiences into pure principle, a perfectly shareable wave. That's why heart coherence is a functional lie detector, because when your heart becomes a laser, the physics is that your heart knows which waves are shareable, and you should not buy a used car from a salesman with shifty eyes, because they can't focus. But when you can absolutely focus the wave, it means all of the waves are shareable. So you see now why that charge implosion would mean that any entity without pure intention could not survive that implosion of bliss. So if you own your bliss at that critical moment, and the more plasma dense your bliss, the more cleansed your aura is. So this is why access to bliss is the solution to all forms of parasitism. And we emphasize again and again at Fusion in the Blood that for tens of thousands of years, humans on Earth have been parasited. The Greys parasited the humans, the Dracos parasited. When Enki Sam Abra he did the cloning, his name was Nudimud the cloner, what did they use the first humans for? Slaves and snack food. They were parasited. But when the humans come to have a big enough aura, all of that changes. So it's not just about teaching governments what a soul is so we can end the religion wars. It's also about teaching us what bliss is that makes a soul, so that we end the parasitism of ET history and we can stand on our own as a species. Remember, the word politic, the origin of the term body politic is body polis, which is a beehive cannot swarm unless there's a coherent plasma aura called the body polis, their collective bliss, which is what makes the collective hive able to steer as one mind. Does that tell you why, when a group of people have a collective bliss process regularly with discipline, that is the biologic definition of government? So, of course, every government on the planet will put you in jail immediately if you teach the entire population how to have bliss together, because it replaces the need for government. But you see, that doesn't have to be a conflict, because governments can embrace that when they understand the natural origin of the self-steering mechanism of biology itself, which is how tornadoes are steered.
Great. Dan, I don't know if I've just heard your conversation enough to start to understand what you're saying, or you've reorganized it to a new level of coherence, but I'm absorbing a lot more of this particular lecture. One question I have, do you think when we actually make formal contact with the ETs, we go to a new level of coherence, the beehive gets bigger, and the human frequency raises to a more of a collective, holistic, cosmological factor of upgrading intelligence, consciousness, and vibratory rate?
Well, you know, my impression is that we're in dramatic contact already. I've had 3 different sources, detailed contact with Pleiadians, and my in-depth telepathic relationship with the Andromedans makes it clear that they were quite, let's say, inconvenienced when Eisenhower and Truman made the wrong treaty with the wrong ETs, and that's what's let a whole bunch of parasites in here. But they're waiting for us to take responsibility for our own plasma direction. And at that point, when we can actually address what gives humans a soul, then we understand why all the ETs are waiting in line to get in here. It's not our technology. No, it's our DNA library. And those who have a soul have a chance. So that's what I'm saying.
What about the collective coherence that might be coming online in June, when the Senate, if they choose to do that, releases information, and suddenly the public awareness around the planet starts to cohere to that next level of understanding of integration. So it's no longer the individual having the experience, it's the collective having an experience that raises our total level of coherence. Is there something to that?
Well, I think that's a beautiful thing and a very good intention, but it also it has to become dramatically clear at that point that our governments have been lying to us for decades and officially allowing abductions. And the human species, because of the lying governments about the ETs, that's got to come to light as well. So there's some karma here. And, you know, we're not, as Laura Eisenhower said, Eisenhower was tricked. We're not he was forced into a, and they were very tricky, those grays, etc. But the point being that when we take responsibility for what evolution is, in that bigger picture, we understand what ET evolution is and what's considered respectable among the extraterrestrials. That's why we teach the ET history in such detail, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. So I think that's a good beginning. I think we need to understand the physics as well as the history story.
But one more question from me. It's not just ET or human evolution. There seems to be, when we meet that coherence on these beings, there's a whole maybe galactic, maybe universal, maybe dimensional upgrade as the mergings of these different consciousness comes into a coherent alignment, right? So it's a kind of bigger than us type thing, and it may have ripple effects throughout the cosmos itself.
Well, yes, a practical example is very famous, that when Billy Meyer was using the beam up technology of the Pleiadians, on the day he was angry, he couldn't use the normal beam up technology. The psychology determines whether you can use the Stargate or portal. And that's an introduction to the emotional discipline required. And that's a key correlate to that evolution.
Great. Hey, Joan, did you have something to say? I mean, Dan, it's great to see you again. Hi, go ahead, Joan.
Dan, that was very, very wonderful. How do people, I mean, unbelievable. I have to go back with my notepad and take notes, but I did get the final concept that your bliss, right? It's your state of bliss that determines your consciousness and your connection to all things, right?
Exactly.
Bottom line.
And bliss is charged radiance, and the rose doesn't unpack until it's packed perfectly first. And that's why understanding perfect compression enables you to understand perfect charge radiance, which is the radiance of bliss. St. Francis went to the forest to pray, and the townspeople called the fire department. They saw the flames.
And when you go to pray, I think they're going to be doing the same thing for sure. Your work is outstanding. Your research, this planet is lifted by you. Seriously, we're so appreciative. So people reach you. Can you give your website one more time?
Sure.
And any events coming up that you want everyone to know about?
Fractalfield.com is the main index, Therify.net for the imploder technology, theimploder.com, and of course, flameinmind.com for the brainwave technology. And my email is info@fractalfield.com.